Welcome to this very special episode of Rediscover People podcast. This is part one of a two-part episode with Miriam Anderson, Pastor Steven Anderson's daughter. We spoke in depth about her experiences at home and how she's gotten away. Welcome to part one of Rediscover People podcast with Miriam Anderson.
And to this day, I feel very bad for my mom because as awful as the things that she has done are, my mom has been abused. From the time that she was a child up until now, she was very abused by her parents as a child, unfortunately, and that breaks my heart to even think about. But into her adult life, she only had a few years of respite between being abused by her parents and being abused by her husband. She got married young. She got married at 21. And she went from being abused by one set of people to a new person who kind of took over her life and abused her. And it makes me feel sad to think about the fact that my mom has never really gotten to experience what healthy relationships in your family look like.
Welcome back to the Rediscover People podcast, where we talk to people about how they rediscovered their calling, they rediscovered things about themselves, their lives through the people that they interact with, the jobs they do, with just anything of life in general. And over the past weekend, we've released a couple of videos. It's been kind of a busy weekend for us, talking to the children of Steven Anderson. He is a preacher out in Phoenix, Arizona, and there have been some accusations against him from his 4 adult children. Since we released those two, another child has come out, which is Solomon, and he released his own video. You can find that and take a look at that as well. But today, we are here with Miriam Anderson. Hi, Miriam.
Hi.
Hi. So I was wondering if you could just give us kind of a summary of what's been happening and how you've reacted to what's been coming out this past weekend alone.
Okay, so basically to give a summary of what's been going on, a few months ago, my brother Isaac came out with an interview on a channel called Dead Domain, where he talked about a few things that had happened in my family that were very disturbing, and I think they also shocked a lot of people who didn't necessarily expect that behavior from my parents. And he was not trying to expose anything in that video. It was actually a defense of himself, but people noticed a lot of the things that he said, although I feel like it was written off largely as, oh, he's just saying these things. Until recently, when my brother came out with a second interview on Dead Domain's channel as well, where he went further talking about even more abuse that happened, in hopes to get CPS involved and possibly my siblings taken away. And he also called for the resignation of my dad, Pastor Steven Anderson. After that all happened, my parents were obviously very upset with this, but a lot of people still were kind of disregarding what he was saying because of, his lifestyle or the way that he presents himself, claiming that he was rebellious and that this was somehow a way at, getting back at my dad for kicking him out of the church or something like that, which is not true. My dad had actually not kicked him out of the church before this happened. My dad was still, on good terms with him, relatively speaking, and he was still allowed at church up until the time that he made that interview. And while all of this is going on in Arizona, someone, while I was at a summer camp in South Carolina, actually made a CPS report regarding me and my siblings. And this CPS report, it's complicated to explain exactly how it came about, but the basic version is that someone overheard something that I said offhand. They were a mandatory reporter, so unfortunately they had to go to CPS. Even though I asked them not to, they told me, hey, it's my job, I have to report this. And obviously I understood that. And the CPS report was not a real danger to my parents in that if someone makes a CPS report that is not in the house, they cannot easily get a warrant. If someone in the household testifies, then they can get a warrant and they can search the house and they can talk to the kids. But without a warrant, CPS will essentially show up at your door and you can tell them to leave, and there's nothing that they can do without a warrant. They can't talk to your kids without a warrant. They can't force you to talk without a warrant. They can't go in your house without a warrant. So my parents were not concerned with the CPS report itself as much as the fact that I was on the other side of the country, and they were very concerned that if CPS came to me and talked to me, I would say something incriminating about them. Because obviously my parents have been extremely abusive my entire childhood, and so if CPS came to me and asked me questions about my parents, I could very well get them in a lot of trouble, especially since I am a member of the household, as I am only 17 years old currently. So my parents panicked because they thought to themselves, well, if CPS comes to her door in South Carolina and she talks to them, who knows what she's going to say? Because when living at my parents' house, whenever CPS came to the door, we were not allowed to talk to CPS under any circumstances. CPS would show up, my parents would pretty much just tell them to jump in a lake, and because they never had a warrant, there was really nothing they could do, and so the case would eventually get dropped, or there would just be some open case somewhere that's really not being investigated because they had no power to do anything without a warrant. And so my parents immediately wanted to send me home. They said, you need to come home right now. We don't want you talking to CPS. And I had told them how the CPS report came about and that, a mandatory reporter had heard something and thought, I need to report this. And my parents originally had understood that because my parents knew me well enough to know that I would not have sought out CPS on my own because I did not originally think that was the best course of action. I didn't want my siblings ending up in some foster system somewhere. That didn't seem like a good plan. Also, I'm familiar with the fact that without a warrant, CPS can do nothing. And with a warrant, CPS is still very powerless in a lot of situations to help victims. I personally have known people who had evidence of abuse, who had testimonies from multiple members of the household, where the kids were not taken out of that home. And unfortunately, kids were continuing to be molested and beaten in those homes because CPS just couldn't do anything for them because, like any other government organization, they're understaffed, underfunded, and they have way too many cases. It's like going to the DMV, except what's on the line is your life, not your driver's license. And so I didn't want to seek out CPS as I didn't think that CPS would be able to help me. And as the rest of my story will show, CPS has not helped in this situation. So I did not want that case to come about. And my parents knew me well enough to know that I obviously had no intentions of involving CPS. So I pleaded with my parents to please let me stay in South Carolina until the date when I was supposed to go home, and that I would not talk to CPS unless they were okay with it, and that if I did talk to CPS, I would be very careful what I said and make sure not to say anything that could be even remotely incriminating. And I begged him to stay, and he eventually was like, okay, well, you can stay for the rest of the month. But he said, if CPS comes to the door, you're not allowed to have a conversation with them. You basically have to prepare this little monologue where you say that everything's fine and you're fine, and then you need to just go in the house and ignore them after that. And my uncle had told me, and my dad both, he had said, well, if she talks to CPS, it'll make you, if you have nothing to hide, it makes you look better to CPS to actually let your child have a conversation with them, because he said, obviously, if this report is made about Miriam, then if Miriam is able to talk to them and have a conversation, then they will probably close the case if she has a conversation with them. But my dad did not want me to do that because he was very worried that I might say something that was incriminating, because he did have something to hide, essentially. And so I made a deal with him that I wouldn't say anything to CPS that was incriminating. I would barely even talk to them. I would pretty much just be like, I'm fine, and leave. And so under that condition, he agreed to let me stay for the rest of the month until I was supposed to head home on August 8th. So I told my uncle this. I said, hey, he's agreed to let me stay, but I can't talk to CPS and have a conversation. I'm only allowed to briefly interact with them just to be like, I'm fine, and leave. And so my uncle was like, okay, if that's what he wants, I'm willing to respect that. He's your parent. Whatever he says goes in this situation. So I was like, okay, if that's what he says, that's what we're going to do. And my dad actually came to town the next week to preach at the new church plant that was in South Carolina, because one of his affiliated churches, they were planting a church nearby where my uncle lived, and he was going to be preaching at the opening service. So him, a couple of my little brothers, and one of my sisters came to town along with my older brother Isaac and his wife. And they all were visiting with us and hanging out. My dad did not actually stay at my uncle's house that weekend, which was a relief to me, because while he had agreed to let me stay, tensions with my family were still pretty high, and they were still very distrustful of me, and they had very hesitantly allowed me to stay for the rest of the month. So I was very concerned that if I did or said anything that even slightly upset them, that they would change their minds and send me home, and I really did not want to be sent home any sooner than I absolutely had to be. And so I pretty much avoided my dad for that weekend. During that time, I also met a guy at that church, so we were spending time together, and I was pretty much just avoiding my dad as much as possible. I very minimally interacted with him when he was there, because I was really nervous about him flying off the handle suddenly, because he had been pretty upset about the CPS report in the first place. And so I avoided him a lot. I interacted with him a couple times, but I made sure that we were never like alone in a room together, and we actually had to, have a conversation about things, or that he never really had an opportunity to talk about that stuff. And so I breathed a sigh of relief when he had left, and he went back to Arizona, and I pretty much thought that that was the end of that. So I thought to myself, okay, I dodged a bullet, I can stay here for the next month, everything's gonna be fine. Until a few days later, when apparently my parents had asked more about the report, and they became convinced that I had said something to someone intentionally, I guess. And my dad was super worried that if CPS came, I would not hold up my end of the deal and say that, I'm fine and nothing's going on. And so he said, "You're evil, you're wicked, you need to come home right now and suffer for what you did." And I tried to explain to him, like, listen, I won't say to see anything in CPS, I promise, just please let me stay out here. And he said, he was like, "You are so stupid and you are so, like, dumb, essentially, that if CPS comes to your house and talks to you, even if you don't want to let anything slip, you will." And he was like, "And I think that you want to because you're evil and whatever." And I pleaded with him and was like, "Please just let me stay." And he was like, "No." And I was like, "Okay, I won't even talk to CPS then. Like, I won't even talk to them." And he said, "No, you need to come home, really, just because you need to suffer." He was like, "I want to make you suffer for what you did." He was like, "Even if you don't talk to CPS, that's no longer even my concern as much." He said, "You need to come home and suffer because what you did, like, you need to pay for it." And I tried to plead with my parents, and I said to my dad, I said, "Well, Dad, if I'd wanted to get you in trouble, if this report was coming from me," I was like, "there would be a lot to talk about here. It wouldn't be some vague thing about Mom." I said, "If I had wanted to make a report, there's plenty of things I could have talked about, and they would have a lot of concrete stories about you guys." And I said, "The fact that they don't is just proof that I didn't seek this out." And he was like, "How dare you even insinuate that we've abused you? We've never abused you guys." And he was getting extremely upset. And I guess that statement from me made him think that I would say something to CPS, because obviously I was acknowledging, without saying it, the fact that my parents have abused me significantly and my siblings. And he absolutely had a fit. My mom had a fit. They were both texting me and frantically calling me and saying, like, "Oh, how dare you say that you've ever been abused? Like, yeah, we bashed your brother's head in, but like, that was years ago." And they kind of acted like they were just playing these things off, and, "Oh, that's all in the past." Which, by the way, I'll get to that, but these things are not in the past. There's a lot of stuff going on currently that is really messed up. But anyway, they kind of were like, "Oh, well, in 20 years of spanking your kids, you're gonna accidentally sometimes, hurt them minorly," just kind of, and like trying to gaslight me into thinking that they hadn't severely abused me and my siblings, like I wasn't there or something. And I tried to like gently and kindly explain to them that no, they could not gaslight me into thinking that my entire childhood is false memories and that I'm misremembering everything. Like, yeah, I remember the entire thing in vivid detail and it just happens to match up with what my siblings are saying. But no, I came up with all of this on my own, according to them. And so they were getting extremely angry at even me insinuating that if I would have made the report, it would have been a lot worse and it would have been very specific stories and not some vague thing about my mom. And so my dad was very angry and he said, "You're gonna be sent home tonight on a plane tonight." And I went downstairs and I explained to my uncle what was going on. I said, "Hey, my dad wants to send me home tonight. He's super angry about this whole thing." And he was obviously saddened by this turn of events. And my aunt actually tried to send my dad a message and be like, "Hey, we really enjoy having her here. She's supervised. She's fine. There's no danger that she's in. We won't let her talk to CPS if you don't want her to, but we really enjoy having her here. Just please let her stay till the end of the month." And he was not having it. So I told my aunt and uncle, "Okay, I'm gonna need one of you guys to drive me to the airport." I went upstairs and started packing my bags, and I was really upset and I was distraught and I was crying and packing my bags. And while my family's downstairs and they're obviously really concerned for me, I'm upstairs, I'm packing my things. I'm very upset at this point. I was supposed to, be staying in South Carolina for another month. I had made plans. And it was really sad because I thought to myself, like, well, when I get home, I know that my parents are going to be super mad. And I didn't realize just then how angry they were. And I was going to realize that in a second. But I was like, you know what? I need to just go home. Like, if they want me to go home, I have to go home. At the end of the day, I'm their kid, whatever. But while I'm packing up my things, my dad called me again. And this time, he sounded so, like, insane and crazed. Like, the things he was saying were just absolutely insane. There's no other way to describe it. He was screaming and yelling and cursing me out with, like, very extreme language, saying all sorts of things about me, calling me all sorts of slurs, and saying just terrible things, talking about totally unrelated things, lying about me, making up stuff. And I was very, like, I was trying to, like, plead with him and just be like, "Hey, listen, like, you know what, I'll come home, but, like, what," I was very just, like, shocked by the way he was acting, I guess, because I don't know how I still have standards for my parents' behavior, but they still, like, manage to disappoint me, even though I don't even have an expectation anymore of them acting normal. But my dad was just screaming and yelling and saying that, "Oh man, you just wait till you get home. I'm gonna make you pay so bad." And threatening me and cursing me out and saying all sorts of filthy language that I won't say on this podcast, but he was saying some really horrific things. And the way that he was saying it too was it was very scary to me. And so in that phone conversation, I remember I was standing there and I was just standing in front of my suitcase, tears are rolling down my face, and as I was listening to my dad screaming at me, calling me wicked and evil and telling me how, "Oh my, your life is over when you get home, like, you are done for," I realized, like, why am I putting up with this? Like, why would I go home to this? Why would I allow myself to be hurt? I'm 17 years old, I'm almost 18, and I thought, I've been hurt by this person my entire life. Why would I go back and just go back to what I already know is gonna happen, With my brother Solomon, it's like, he watched YouTube at my age, and that wasn't allowed, and he got his head bashed in. So I had an idea of what making you pay means in my family, and I thought, why would I go back to that? Like, why would I go back so that my dad can break all of my stuff and hurt me and beat me up and lock me up? Because I had no doubt that my parents would not let me in public. Because usually when they would assault us or something like that, they would keep us, like, in the house and take away all of our devices so that we couldn't contact anyone for help. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to be locked up in some room of my house after being beaten up horribly. I didn't want whatever was going to happen to me that he was so sure was going to be a fitting punishment for this. Because, quite frankly, their idea of punishment is abuse. And so I thought to myself, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go home. I'm not going to put myself through that. And so I went downstairs and I told my aunt and uncle, I said, I'm not going back home tonight. I said, whether or not I stay here is not, going to decide that. I said, if you guys will have me and you will keep me in your home, I would really appreciate that. But I said, if not, I said, if you drop me off at at the airport, I said, I will not get on the plane. I will go somewhere else. And I told them essentially, obviously it's better for me to be with family in a nice home, and you guys obviously are Christians, you have good morals, I trust you, and I've lived with you for months now, so this would obviously make the most sense for me to stay with you guys. But I said, if you won't have me, that doesn't mean I'm going back to my family, because I said I will not go back to my family. Because that phone conversation with my dad just really solidified things for me, realizing that my dad, no matter what I said or did, would not be appeased. That my dad wanted some kind of strange vengeance on me, and that no matter what I said, no matter how much I pleaded with him, he was going to hurt me when I got home. And when I realized that, I realized, you know what, I'm not going to go home. If that's what's going to happen to me, I can't deal with that. In the past, as a child, it was very difficult for me to deal with the way I was treated by my parents. I was often suicidal. I've actually attempted suicide a couple times now. So I was not interested in going back to my parents hurting me. And then I knew what that would do to my mental health. I knew that I was doing much better now that I was living with my uncle. And I thought about it. I finally, my entire life, I was so scared to disobey my parents. I was so scared to go against them. I was so scared of what would happen to me. And they were always saying, like, you don't get this option. Like, it was never on the table for me to, not go through that stuff. And I finally was able to take a step back and think, well, actually, I don't have to put myself through this anymore. Actually, I'm old enough and I have enough resources to where I don't have to go back. And I can move on with my life and I can heal. And that was a really powerful step, because it was something that my entire life I've been terrified to do. And so my aunt and uncle, when I explained that to them, they were 100% supportive of me. And my uncle said, listen, I will protect you no matter what happens. And he said, if this is your final decision that you won't go home, he said, and I know that you're someone who thinks about stuff before you do it. And he's like, I know that obviously you've given this a lot of thought. And he said, I know that this is very hard for you to do. So if you're willing to do this, if you're willing to take such a dramatic step, he said, then I believe you obviously have good reason to do so. And so he said, if this is your final decision, I respect your decision. And he said, and I will let you continue living here, because he said, you're godly, you're not doing anything that I don't disapprove of or disapprove of. He said, you've been abiding by my rules, like, and I'm here to protect you, like, and I will keep you in this environment because I believe it's safer for you than being out there in the world. And he said, obviously, if you're living with me, you can still have Christian guidance, and you can still have, in a way, some, like, parental guidance in your life. Because obviously when I was living with my aunt and uncle, like, while they didn't impose a ton of rules on me, because obviously I'm practically an adult and I pretty much parent myself at this point in life, they obviously, guided me with some Christian standards, and obviously they weren't letting me be out all night or something like that. They were more, supervising me and keeping tabs on what I was doing, which I totally respect, and I like that, because obviously as a young woman who's not living with my family, a lot of accusations could be, thrown at me, and the fact that they could, supervise me, it defended me against those accusations, because my uncle was obviously looking out for my best interest. He was always very supervising of me when I was, going out with people or something like that. And so I was happy to stay there. And I sent my parents a message that night, basically letting them know that I would not be home. It was a very polite and cordial message, I think. And I didn't lash out at them. I didn't say anything mean or hurtful. I didn't even be like, oh, you terrible, abusive people. I honestly just told them, hey, I don't think I can keep doing this. I can't keep living with you guys. It's not healthy for me. It's not going to lead to me, being healthy. Like, I need to have time to heal. I need to, stay here. And my parents did not respond to that at all. They did not text me. They did not call me. My dad sent one message to my uncle that night where he called him a liar, but that was it. He didn't text or call, and they pretty much just ignored it. And so the next morning I woke up, I was locked out of my phone and my laptop. I was locked out of my bank account. I was locked out of all of my, apps essentially. I ended up having to actually hack into and factory reset my phone to even use it. And I had to set up a new bank account with my uncle's help. I had to do all these things to basically start over. And I was starting over essentially with a suitcase full of clothes that I'd brought from Arizona. So I really didn't have anything. Like, before I'd had, obviously a car back home. I'd been in college. I had had like multiple jobs in Arizona. So it was like I lost all of that. I lost all of my possessions, which obviously because I was working, I had saved up and bought a lot of valuable things. I lost all of those things. All of even silly things like my clothes, just anything that I owned. My entire life was essentially gone when I made the decision to not come home, because I was no longer in the state I lived in. I couldn't go home essentially at that point, because when I sent that text message, it was a turning point. There was no plan B. It was like, well, now I don't have anything. I don't own anything except for this suitcase of clothes. My family probably hates me now, which I'll get to that in a second. And it was a scary feeling. But at least I had my aunt and uncle helping me. I thought to myself, well, I have a nice family here and I can live here until I'm 18. And I planned on, once I was 18, moving back to Arizona with the money that I earned from my job in South Carolina. So when that happened, I immediately got a job and I thought to myself, okay, I can start saving up money. I would still text my parents and update them on my life. During this time, I had started dating the guy that I'd met at the church plant that my dad preached at. And so I would update them on that. I would send them pictures from what I was doing and pretty much just send them messages saying, hey, I love you, hope you're doing well. Because I didn't have any intention of retaliating against them or hurting them. It was more about just, I knew that they were unhealthy for me to be around. I knew that I didn't want to be abused by them.
Right.
I wasn't trying to hurt their feelings in any way.
I have a question for you because that brings up an interesting point. So this happens, and then you decide this, and then you get a job, and you're saying in the meantime, you're messaging them, you're talking to them. I saw that you even posted about your boyfriend and how they approved, right? Like you even spoke to them about that. How much time is that from that to the next incident?
So from the time that I originally sent my parents that message saying that I wasn't going to go home to the time that my dad sent the police after me was a very substantial amount of time. I don't know the exact numbers on that, but I know that my dad preached at the church plant on July 5th. Yeah, July 5th. Because I remember that because it's where I met my boyfriend. But he preached at the church plant on July 5th. And it was only like a few days after that, I believe, that the whole thing where I said I'm not going to come home happened. It might have been a week, but it was very shortly after that, essentially. It was sometime close to that, and they did not send the police after me until let me think. I need to think about this, but it was like over a month later, I want to say. Like it was a substantial amount of time. So for the most part, they ignored it. I want to say it was actually probably more than a month. Let me think, because I believe they sent, oh yeah, now I remember. So they sent the police after me, I want to say on September 4th. Or September 3rd is when he originally made the call, actually. Sorry, it's hard to remember these things exactly. But I believe he actually made the call on September 3rd. So keep in mind, the original me telling them I wasn't coming home was sometime around July 5th, probably July 10th or somewhere in that neighborhood. So it was probably around July 10th, vaguely. Maybe July 10th, July 13th, somewhere in that neighborhood. And he didn't bother calling the police or seeking any kind of way to get me home. until September the 3rd. So a lot of time had passed, and the original date that I was supposed to come home had passed, and they had made no effort to retrieve me. My dad had barely even communicated with me. I had sent him a message on his birthday saying that I loved him and I hope he had a good day, and he said thank you, and that was the only text message he ever sent me. After that, I had sent him a message letting him know that I was fine, that I had gotten a job, and that I was dating the guy that I had met and that he had met at that event. And I told him, hey, we're dating. I sent him a few photos from that weekend of me and my boyfriend and some other just people and stuff that I had been doing. And he didn't respond with a text message. He liked the photos of me and my boyfriend. Like, you know, on iPhone, you can put a little like on it. I didn't include that in the screenshot with Jordan because I originally didn't want to put my boyfriend, like, his face on the internet because I didn't want him, like, implicated in any of this because obviously I don't think he wants to be implicated in any of this, and I want to respect that because, you know, obviously he doesn't want to be subject to all this bullying. So that was my only communication with my dad between the time that I sent him the message and he pretty much ignored it and they just cut me out of their lives essentially, and the time that he called the police. He never tried to call me. He never texted me saying, hey, will you please come home? I had talked to my mom and I had told my mom that I would come home if her and my dad would agree to not lay hands on me like they had said that they would, and if I could hear from my own dad's mouth that he wanted me home, because I said I don't even think dad wants me home right now. And she pretty much told me, like, well, you know, like, of course he wants you home. And I said, well, if he wants me home, he can just pull out his phone and text me and say, hey, I want you home and I'm not going to beat the living snot out of you. And that was something that he refused to do. Like, I told my mom probably 20 times, hey, if you guys are going to agree to not lay hands on me, I will come home. Because for me, obviously being 17, I don't want to be out here with no family. It's sad. I didn't want to live out here. This is not what I wanted. And so I don't like fighting with my family. That's not pleasant. No matter what they've done to me, no matter what kind of distasteful people they've kind of proven themselves to be, I don't like the idea of, like, being separated from my family and there being this huge family rift. I mean, I want my kids to have, like, grandparents and stuff. And it's very depressing for me, actually, to not be able to, you know, be friends with them, essentially, because of the kind of people that they've shown themselves to be. And so I was trying to mend things and trying to be like, hey, you know, if you guys will just agree that you won't lay hands on me, and if you'll tell me from your own mouth that you want me back, I'll come back. And my mom, just time and time again, just would not do that. Would not agree that they were not going to lay hands on me, would not agree that they wanted me back. And so I didn't go back, but I was still very polite to them. I still texted her and was very kind to her. I did not, to this day, I have not said a cross word to either of my parents. I have not said anything rude or hurtful. And that's something that I'm glad about, because no matter what they've done, I don't want to be someone who's told my parents terrible things. And my dad has unfortunately told me all sorts of terrible things laced with obscenities, but I have not done that to him, and that's something I'm glad about, because we really can't take back words, and no matter what my parents have done to me, I know that I don't want to have said those things to them. I don't want to, you know, someday they're gonna be old, and, you know, I don't really know how long my parents have left on this earth, but I don't want to, no matter what they've done, I don't want to have said those things to them, because I know people regret a lot of words said in anger, and obviously at this point in my life, it's hard for me to not be a little bit upset with them and disappointed in them for the way that they've treated me and what they've done to me and my siblings. And it's obviously hard for me to see how they've hurt my siblings, like, even more than how they've hurt me. It breaks my heart, and it gets me emotional every time I think about it. So
Yeah.
not going to talk too much about that.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting what you're talking about and what you're saying, because a lot of the criticism or people asking questions online is like, well, why now? And how did they all come together to do this to poor Steven Anderson, right, kind of thing. And from what you're telling me, it's kind of just a sequence of events that is very coincidental.
Yeah.
Right? Isaac's just trying to defend himself. John does want something to be done, but probably because he has concerns for even the children that are still in the home. And then at the same time, you're just kind of talking to someone, this gets blown out of proportion at a camp, and then it becomes all this, right? And so it's all kind of just rolling on its own. And I can hear your heart that, you know, you still care about your parents. You still think that way no matter what it is. And that's a very nuanced adult way to think, because a lot of people have been through abuse and then they just get through it. A lot of people are saying, oh, they're just whining because they got spanked, and I still love my parents even though I got hit. And the main point we're trying to drive here is that there's a difference between getting disciplined and the abuse that happened at home, so much so that you were afraid to go back, right?
Yeah, and I will say this, that along the way in this whole chain of events, I did not want for things to end up where they are right now. I did not want to be a fugitive living on, you know, the other side of the country. I did not want to have to talk about this publicly, because I don't think what people have not really thought about, a lot of these people that are coming out and saying, oh, they're just like, is like, this is not a pleasant thing for me to talk about publicly. When I made the interview with Jordan, that was only probably the 4th or 5th time I've ever spoken about these things in my life. Aside from a few times when I was a kid, I would admit to people how I actually got injuries. Like, I remember having a bloody mark on the side of my arm, and a girl accidentally saw it because my sleeve was too short. And I remember actually confiding in her and saying, yes, this is from my parents. And I made her swear up and down that she would never tell anyone. And I don't blame people like that for never coming forward at the time, because I did make them promise that they wouldn't say anything. I was super scared of my parents. And obviously when someone's a child, it's easy to write off these things as, oh, you know, every kid says silly things and stuff. And I think that also I was a tomboy, so when I had bruises, it was like, you know, it's pretty par for the course with someone who climbs trees or rides bikes to have bruises. So the bruises from abuse went unnoticed by people. And I don't blame anyone for that. I don't for one second think, well, someone should have said something, because we all are kind of aloof, and naturally I think people like to mind their own business and not poke into other people's matters. So I'm not upset about any of that going unnoticed, and I really did not want to go to CPS. I knew that CPS wouldn't do anything substantial. This whole situation has been me trying to de-escalate and my parents forcing my hand. For example, when I wanted to stay with my uncle and not come home because my dad outright threatened to physically attack me, I said to them, I said, well, if anyone asks you where I am, you can just tell them I'm on vacation. I was like, I'm not going to talk about any of this publicly unless you make it a public thing. I was like, you're welcome to tell them, and you can see that in my original message that I sent them. But I told them, if you want to tell people that I'm just on vacation, you're welcome to, because I'm not seeking any kind of revenge or anything like that. I said, I just don't want to be home because I know what's going to happen to me if I'm home. And so it wasn't me going out against my parents immediately. It was that they forced my hand when they made me stay there, because it's like, well, I can't come home and just be beaten up and abused. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm practically an adult. That's silly to think that I would go home and just let myself be abused. Whatever people think about it, it's like, I will be 18 in 4 months. So it's kind of ridiculous to argue over, well, those 4 months, you know, nothing dramatic is going to change about me as a person from now until the time I'm 18. So to argue and say that I'm not an adult now, but I magically become an adult when I turn 18 is a little bit silly. And so it wasn't me trying to go against my parents. And then when I unfortunately had to go on the run, and I'll explain that in a second, that was, again, my dad forcing my hand. I had not wanted to leave my uncle's house. I was perfectly content and happy to stay there. I was happy to have minimal communication with my parents, but be cordial. I was happy to just work my job. I got a great job while living there, and I loved my job. I was very happy with it. And so,
Yeah, let's talk about that. Sorry about that. On why it is that you then did come out on that podcast, right? There was a series of events. Okay, so your dad calls the police sometime in the beginning of September. Can you just explain that part and then why it is that you decided
absolutely.
to be on? Yeah.
So on September the 3rd, I believe it was, which I might be like a day or two off, but I believe it was September the 3rd, that I got home from work. It was just like any other day, right? I got home from work. I, hung out with my family, had dinner, and that night I went to bed and was woken up shortly after going to bed by my uncle shaking me awake, and he was like, hey, the police are at your door, like downstairs. They're downstairs and they want to talk to you. And he said, if you don't want to talk to them, I can tell them that, but you should probably go talk to them. And I said, okay. So I'm all tired, and I come downstairs, and the police are standing there. There's an officer on my porch, or my uncle's porch rather. And he says, hi, are you Miriam? And I said, yeah. And he said, hey, I'm here to inform you that your dad has told you that you need to come home. Because the way that these things work is that once they inform me that I'm supposed to go home, if I don't, then potentially my uncle could get a kidnapping charge, even though obviously my uncle is not kidnapping me because I was there of my own free will. That's just the charge that my dad could potentially raise, as I am technically a minor. And so I told the officer, I said, well, do I have to go home? Like, is there no way for me to just stay here? Like, I'm 17 years old. And he said, no, there isn't. And I had originally not wanted to talk about any of the abuse that my parents were engaging in because I didn't want this to become some huge police matter. That's embarrassing for that stuff to become public. I didn't want that to happen. But because the officer made it clear that I was going to be forced to go home, and I knew that that was not a safe option for me, I told the officer, I said, listen, I'm not going to get super specific right now, but I said, my parents are extremely abusive, and if I go home, bad things are going to happen to me. Like, they are going to hurt me big time. Like, really bad things are going to happen. And the officer said, well, if that's what's going on, because he said that was not my understanding of the situation. He said, if that's what's going on and they're abusive, he said, then obviously we will not send you home until that gets investigated. And he said, you're clearly safe here. You're clearly doing fine. You're clearly taking care of yourself. So we're not going to just suddenly remove you from this clearly safe environment to take you somewhere that you are afraid to go to. And he was very kind. He was very polite to me. And he basically told me, hey, the best way to go about this is if you can just resolve it civilly, because if this goes to court and stuff, it's going to be a huge mess. And you're going to be dealing with all this. Your siblings are going to have to testify. It's going to be super stressful for all of you. So he said, the best thing that you can do right now is if you can contact your dad and basically let him know that you're not going to come home, and that if he tries to make you come home, you're going to contact CPS. Because he said CPS, if there's an open investigation, they're not sending you back. So it would protect you from having to go back to that unsafe environment. But he said it's obviously better to just take a more, just less radical approach and just text him, let him know, hey, I'm not coming home either way, so you might as well just give up the effort, because otherwise CPS is going to be involved, and you clearly don't want that.
Right. So you did text him that?
Yes. So my uncle texted him and said, hey, listen, we're about to have a phone call, and I need you to act civil or I'm going to hang up. My uncle called him, and my dad screamed into the phone before my uncle could even say anything. My dad screamed into the phone because my uncle, actually, he had said, he was like, I'm here with Miriam in the room with me and my wife's praying, he said, and we're going to talk to you. And my dad screamed into the phone. He said, first of all, go F yourself. And my uncle was not going to put up with that kind of bullying, so he hung up the phone. He had warned my dad that if my dad was disrespectful or ridiculous during that phone call, that he would hang up. And so he immediately hung up, and he still did text my dad and give him another chance. And he said, listen, either you're going to let Miriam stay here with your consent, or she will contact CPS. Because if you don't let her stay here, then you're basically forcing her hand to have to go to CPS, which is true. Because if he would have just given his consent for me to stay there, then I could have stayed there without causing this huge blow-up mess that no one likes. And so he pretty much just told my uncle again to, F off or whatever. He sent a finger emoji and was like, I don't care, come at me, whatever. And I think he was feeling invincible because no CPS report has ever gone anywhere in the past, because you can literally tell CPS to just leave if they don't have a warrant. Like, there is nothing that CPS can do without a warrant. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but if CPS doesn't have a warrant, which is super difficult for CPS to get, but if they don't have a warrant, there's literally nothing that they can do to you. They can't talk to you. They can't talk to your kids. They can't search your house. They can't even go inside your house unless you invite them in if they don't have a warrant. And my parents know that. My parents have dealt with CPS. They have specific lawyers designed for dealing with CPS. That's what they do. That's literally what they do. They have a lot of legal advisement. And so my parents were very aware of the fact that without a warrant, there's pretty much nothing that CPS can do to them. And so they felt very invincible. And my dad was like, okay, bring it. Send CPS. And so I was like, okay, you know what? Maybe CPS will do something. Maybe they won't. But I need to involve CPS because, you know what? That was my decision. I thought about it. And so, and I thought about it also and realized that maybe if CPS could pull my siblings out of the home, by some miracle they actually did something and worked something out, that my siblings would be so much better off living with like family or something like that than being in that household, because my siblings are still suffering to this day. And so, and I've seen the effects on them of the things that have happened. And I'll get into that in a second. But basically, because of that, I was planning on going to CPS like one of the following days. I obviously had a job, so I couldn't go the next morning because I had to show up to work very early the next morning. So I unfortunately did not get hardly any sleep that night. I was up very late talking to my aunt and uncle, and we were discussing what was best for my siblings and what we could do for them, how we could help them. I was talking about possibly when I turned 18, being able to take some of them in and offer them housing and safety and food, because I've always cared for my siblings a lot, and their futures really matter to me, and I really don't want them to have to go through what I went through, essentially, because I know what that did to me, and I know how hard it was, and I know that a lot of things from my childhood will stick with me for the rest of my life. And as much as I really do want to heal, and I really do want to work on these things, I know that there's a lot of permanent scars that people can't see, that are on the inside. And I don't want that for my siblings. So we were discussing what we could do. We were discussing the possibility of maybe my parents going to anger management and therapy, and, really healing for my parents as well, because obviously I love them and I love my siblings, but I really want my parents to get better as well. And so we stayed up super late talking about all this. And then once I went to my room, I really couldn't fall asleep. I was really tormented by a lot of thoughts about what was going on. And the next morning, I got up early. It was time to go to work. And the last time I saw my aunt and uncle was that morning. I was leaving. I was super flustered. And I was like, oh, I got to get to work. I'm going to be late. I was in a terrible mood. And I remember my uncle was like, did you pack a lunch? Because I usually pack a lunch. And he was like, no. And I said no. And he like shoved a 20 in my hand. I was like, go get yourself something to eat. Like, you can't just quit caring for yourself during this situation. Like, because he was obviously super worried about me because I was super upset and stressed. I wasn't sleeping well, and I probably looked like hell that day. And I showed up at work that morning. Unfortunately, my coworkers had called out sick. 2 different inspectors arrived, both the district inspector and the health inspector, and my boss was just kind of MIA for the first half of the day. So it was just me. I was super new to this job, and it was like a hellish day. Like, I was feeling sick. I was worried about my family. I was worried about the fact that the police had literally been at my house the night before. I thought about the fact that, I have to go to CPS. It's going to be this whole mess. We might even be in court. I didn't want any of that. And while I'm at work, I was super like busy. I skipped multiple of my breaks that day. And so I finally took a break once my boss showed up and once another coworker showed up and could help me. So I took a break, and on my break, I saw that I had a missed call from my brother. So I called my brother back, and my brother says, and this is my brother Isaac, to be clear, but my brother says, hey, guess what? Dad is at Uncle Clint's house right now. And I said, what? Like, he's where? He's at Uncle Clint's house? And my brother was like, yeah, apparently he hopped on a plane and just drove over to his house and is basically threatening my uncle and saying that I need to be given up and given to him immediately. And so I panicked because I'm already having this hellish day at work, and I'm thinking to myself, like, pardon me, I was thinking to myself, like, my dad is now in the state where I'm in, and he could have potentially, like, attack me or something. Like, I don't know what he's gonna do. It's already super irrational to get on a plane and just fly over. Like, he'd already involved police, but no, he hops on a plane without telling me. He had still, at this point, never texted me and told me to come home since the original text message to him. He hadn't called me. He hadn't tried to talk to me. Just without talking to me, without saying anything to me or my uncle, he shows up at my uncle's house threatening my uncle and saying, if you don't get her out right now, I'm going to get police. My uncle was like, please call police, because he wanted police to be there. He was worried about my dad potentially physically attacking him. And so I immediately called my uncle and said, hey, like, what's going on? And my uncle put me on the phone with the officer, and the officer said, hey, we have your dad here. He wants you home. And he said, we're going to talk to you and get your testimony personally. So he said, where do you work? And I immediately told him where I worked. My uncle had already talked to the police, and he had thought that I worked at a different branch of Starbucks than I did. So he had accidentally given them the wrong branch of Starbucks, which that's, whatever. But he had tried to comply with police on that point. And I gave them the correct address. And so they showed up. And police showed up at the Starbucks where I worked. I had actually gone to my boss and said, hey, here's what's going on. Police is going to be here and my dad might be with them, and warned him about all this because I wanted to be as respectful as I could of the company, because it's obviously super awkward for them to have this like crazy guy showing up and the police, and it's embarrassing, it's not a good brand for the company. And so I went to him and I was trying to be super respectful and like, hey, I'm so sorry about this, but here's the situation. And so he talked to security and warned them, and I was put in like the conference room within the break room. And so they sat me down and they said, hey, when the officer comes, we'll show him into this room. So the officer arrived and he basically asked me to explain everything, and I did. And I explained how my parents were abusive, how they had threatened me, and how I decided not to come home because they were threatening me with violence. And he said to me, he was like, well, because you're in South Carolina, until he assaults you in South Carolina, we have no jurisdiction. He said, for us to have jurisdiction in this matter, he would have to assault you here, or you would have to have him like in writing making a specific threat, like texting you, I will bash your head in with blah, blah, blah. Like, it has to be either a very specific threat of exactly what he will do, and he has to be stating that he's going to do it in South Carolina, too. It has to be like a threat for South Carolina that I can prove in writing from the time. It was like, or he has to assault you on South Carolina soil, essentially. So, obviously, neither of those things were going to happen, because if he were to text me such an absurd message, like, he has no motive to give like a little instruction manual of exactly how he's gonna assault me. My dad is a smart guy. He's not gonna put down in writing like, and then I'm going to bash your head in and throw you. Oh, this is like, obviously he wasn't gonna do that. And as far as him assaulting me on South Carolina soil, there was a high chance of that, but only if he got his hands on me. These people had forgotten that I had not been living with my dad. My dad lives in a different state. So he had not assaulted me on South Carolina soil because he hadn't had an opportunity to. And I tried to explain to the officer that, yes, it would become his jurisdiction once he assaulted me after I was given to him, but I said that it would be too late because my dad could easily permanently injure or kill me in a fit of rage, assaulting me. Like, when you bash someone's head into something, there's really no telling what's going to happen. I don't want to be physically injured. I don't want to be permanently maimed or killed. And I also tried to explain to the officer that the first thing my dad was going to do was take away my phone, take away any way that I had of calling for help, take away anything that I could record with. My dad was obviously not going to be so silly as to let me keep my phone and let me record him assault me. And I also tried to explain that even if I did somehow manage to get a recording of him assaulting me, it would be too late at that point. Because, you know what, yeah, then I could report him once I'm injured or dead. Like, that really doesn't help anything, because at that point the harm has been done.
And your dad is in the building at this time?
So my dad was in the building. He was not allowed into the room where I was. He was expected to stay outside. And while I'm talking to the officer, I was told by employees there, because they were very upset by this, he was screaming and yelling. And I believe he might have been on a phone call of some sort, but I know he was screaming and yelling. I'm not sure if it was just at the general public that was there, or if he was yelling at someone on the phone. But I know that the security came to me concerned because they said he's screaming and yelling something about having a wicked, disobedient daughter or something. Obviously talking about me. and he was having some sort of like rage meltdown out there, and he was freaking out. He was yelling at people like, "Why won't you give me my daughter?" and stuff. And he was just totally freaking out and screaming and yelling out there while I'm talking to the officer. And so I get to the end of this thing with the officer, and the officer pretty much just told me, "There's nothing I will do for you." He said, "It's not my jurisdiction until he assaults you here." So he said, "You have to go back to your dad right now." And I was like, "I can't do that." And he was like, "No, like, you don't get any option." He was like, "You're in police custody right now. You're not allowed to leave until you go to your dad." And I was like, "Listen, you have to listen to me." Like, I was like, "I'm in major danger right now." And I said, "Is there anything you can do?" I said, "Anything." I said, "You're a cop, you know." I said, "You have more options here. Surely there's something you can pull out of your hat where there's something to delay this, something you can do." And he said, "No, there's nothing." He said, and I was like, "Come on, like, please." I was like, "I'm in danger right now." And I was starting to freak out at this point. Like, I was getting, like, very emotional, which I unfortunately was a little bit rude to the officer because it really bothered me that he just essentially did not care what was going on. He was like, "Well, once he assaults you," he was like, "take a video of it and, send it to the police and then we'll do something." And so I was very frustrated with him, to tell the truth. And I was begging him, like, "Is there anything you could do to possibly delay this?" And he was like, "No." So I thought to myself, well, my aunt and uncle live 40 minutes away. I had their car key at the time, so I said, "Well, why don't we wait for my aunt and uncle to arrive?" Because I was going to give them my car key to their car, and I was going to talk to them or whatever. And he was like, "Why do we need to wait for them?" And I said, "Well, if they show up," I said, "maybe seeing them here will piss off my dad. And if he gets in some kind of physical altercation or specifically threatens them, and we get him on CCTV threatening them," I said, "then it would become your jurisdiction." And I said, "Just seeing them will probably really upset him." So I said, "Even though we're grasping at straws with this," I said, "it's worth a chance." Because at the end of the day, my life was essentially on the line here. Like, what was about to happen in those next 20 minutes or something was about to determine the course of, the beginning of my adult life. And that's a big deal. Like, what my dad was planning to do to me was unclear, but I knew it was going to be horrific. And he had said as much multiple times to me. And based on past events, I fully believed him that he was going to follow through on those threats. And so I said, "We're going to wait for them." And all the Target employees, because I worked at a Starbucks inside a Target, they all sided with me and were like, "Yeah, just let the girl wait for her aunt and uncle." And during this time, I had also thought of the idea of escape because I realized that the police would do nothing for me. So I was really, part of the reason why I asked for my aunt and uncle was because I was already entertaining the idea of running, and asking for them bought me 40 more minutes to decide exactly how I would do that and line up someone to take me out of town. Because I knew that if I went missing, they would immediately start looking for me, and a girl on foot is not as hard to find as someone immediately out of town. So I knew I had to get out of town immediately. Like, once I ran, I knew that I needed to go straight out of town. So I was trying to figure out a way to do that since I didn't know anyone in South Carolina that could help me. I didn't want to involve any of, like, my previous friends or family because I knew that they would probably be questioned, anyone that I had had any connection to. And so I was basically trying to find essentially kind of a random person to take me out of town, which is really weird. But I had 40 more minutes to basically plot how I would escape because I was in a conference room within a break room. There was no easy way out. I have an officer watching me, and I'm in a back room, essentially locked up. And so I asked the officer, I said, "Hey, can I go to the bathroom?" And he was like, "I think you're trying to run." Because he had previously told me that I should book a different flight at the airport and just get on that. And I had told him, well, that's not easy to do. Like, I should probably run before that. And so he was like, "I think you're trying to run right now." And I was like, "No, no." I was like, I had this, like, large lemonade cup that was empty from earlier in the day. And I said, "Oh, I drank this. Like, I need to go to the bathroom." Which I didn't particularly need to go to the bathroom, but it was actually just so that I could see if there was any way I could get away. Like, even, when I went to the bathroom, possibly sneak out. I wasn't really sure exactly what my options were at this point, but I knew I was running out of time. And so he was super suspicious of me, but he eventually agreed to let me go to the bathroom with the understanding that a couple of Target employees that were women would actually accompany me into the bathroom and watch me, and that he would be waiting outside. So me and this little entourage composed of a few Target employees and him, we walk out of the conference room into the break room, we walk out, and I had been told that my dad was far away, but I did not realize that I would be able to see him and that he would be able to see me. So we walk out, and I look left and right, and my dad is to the left where the cafe was, and he's standing out there and with his and he's standing and he has like this super like angry, menacing look on his face. And he looked pissed. And I don't know if it was because he saw me or if he had just looked angry because he had obviously been yelling at people for the last 40 minutes. But he looked very, very angry and honestly terrifying. And even if he hadn't, just seeing my dad would have triggered me either way. But seeing him like that messed with me bad. So I literally screamed and just like dropped to the floor like that. That was it. Like in 1 second, like I screamed like a really just like blood curdling scream, dropped to the floor, and immediately like I could not breathe. I was laying on the ground, and I felt like the wind had been like knocked from me, like that feeling when you get like kicked in the chest or something. And I just dropped to the floor, and I could not breathe. And I immediately I got up, and I clawed my way up. I was like on the ground. I crawled up and I sprinted inside the break room. Like I sprinted so quick. I was in there. Like I was not gonna stay out there where my dad was. I was terrified. And I sprinted inside the break room, and I was immediately like crying and shaking. Like I could not even breathe properly, and I was like and what ended up happening was I started throwing up because I had eaten like lunch that day, and that was like the only meal I'd had. But I started throwing up. I was like, give me a trash can, give me a trash can. And I started throwing up everywhere, which was super embarrassing and honestly horrible. And I was struggling to catch my breath. I threw up, and I wanted to like get a water, and I almost I felt like I was gonna pass out. Like I was like super dizzy, and I was like violently shaking, and I went to go get a water, and the vending machine at like my work was actually touchscreen, and I was trying to buy the water, and I couldn't because I was shaking so bad that I kept pressing the wrong buttons, and I had to give my money to one of my coworkers and ask them to buy me a water because I wanted to drink something to get like the foul mouth of like, or the foul taste out of my mouth of like the sick, obviously. And so they bought me a bottle of water, and I was like super, like I was struggling to breathe. I was freaking out at this point. Like I felt like so, like there was like a pounding, like my head was hurting so bad, and I was struggling to breathe. I had just thrown up. I was shaking violently, and they were like, okay, we're gonna take you through the fire exit to go to the bathroom, because they said we're gonna take you out of the building and then back in the building. So they turned off the fire alarms for a minute. They took me out of the fire exit. They took me back into the building through the entrance on that side, and they took me to the bathroom. And in the bathroom, I was like freaking out. I was begging them, like, please just don't give me back to him. Like, please, you don't know what he's gonna do to me. Like, you don't know what he's done to me in the past. Like, you can't let this happen. I was like, I am in danger right now. Like, you need to take this seriously. And they just, the Target employees all felt bad for me. They didn't want that to happen to me. But the cop just was indifferent. He was like, well, you have to go back. And so they took me back to the bathroom, and there was even a moment in the parking lot where I just thought about sprinting, like even though a cop was walking right with me. But I went back to the break room, and my aunt and uncle had not quite arrived there yet, but they were about to be there because obviously some time had elapsed in the meantime while these events are occurring. And I was like still totally losing it, and the cop was like, okay, I'm actually gonna take you back to him right now, like before your aunt and uncle even arrived. And that made it like so much worse because he was like, you need to go right now, like. And so I freaked out again, and like I was totally just melting down at this point. And it was really unfortunate because I had previously like tried to hold it together so that people wouldn't think that I was just being emotional or crazy, and that they would take me seriously, and that I wanted to be able to speak articulately and explain everything in an understandable manner. And so I was totally losing it. I was struggling to even breathe at this point, and my head felt like it was so like painful. Like I was like in so much just like pain in my head. Like I felt like my head was just being like stabbed. And so I was like struggling to breathe. It felt like someone was like sitting on my chest. It was insane. And so I was like, you know what? I want an ambulance. I want to go to the hospital. Because they had asked me, the lady who had taken me in the bathroom, she had asked me, hey, have you ever had panic attacks before? And she was like, do you take medication for it? And I said, no. But I said, I want to go to the hospital because even though I wasn't planning on taking any medication for a panic attack, I figured that at the very least the hospital would buy me some time. And at best, it could either help me run away or maybe they could do something or involve CPS because I wasn't sure if this officer was necessarily correct since the officer the night before had contradicted what this officer had said.
Well, and the idea that all this is actually happening to you, the way you're feeling, the way you're reacting, it's obvious that you're afraid.
Yeah, I was terrified. Like, it was very embarrassing for me because obviously as a grown woman, it's pretty embarrassing to be like shaking and crying and throwing up. That's not anything that anyone wants to do. You know, that's super embarrassing. These are people that I worked with. That was really embarrassing for me, honestly. But I said I wanna go to the hospital. You know, I want an ambulance. And so the officer called an ambulance, and I think he was happy for it to not really be his problem because he figured he would escort me to the hospital, and then the police there would take over and return me to my dad when I was released. And so I got in the ambulance, and I told the ambulance workers that I was like, hey, like you can't let anyone see me. Like I don't want my dad coming in there. And they said, hey, we're gonna put you under a protective custody. We know what's going on, like at least a little bit. They were like, so you're gonna be under protective custody. They said the police won't be allowed in, your dad won't be allowed in. They said we have police on the inside of the hospital that will be made aware of what's going on. But they said your dad will not be allowed to visit you under any circumstances. And they said no one will. They said no one can come and visit you no matter who they are because being under protective custody in a hospital, literally no one can see you. No matter who they are, no matter if they're your legal guardian or not, no one is allowed in your hospital room except for doctors and nurses. So I was taken inside the hospital. I was seen by a few nurses and a doctor. They offered me some medication for my nausea and whatever, and they were trying to help me out with the panic attack. They were trying to have me do some breath exercises and stuff, and help me to the best of their abilities. And after the doctor saw me, he asked me some questions. I explained the entire situation with my parents. They also had me just give them the right to treat and all that kind of stuff. Because I was over 16, I could sign off on those papers. They asked me who was my legal guardian. I told them that my dad was, and my mom. I gave them both their names. And so I explained the entire situation, and the doctor left my hospital room, and a few nurses came to see me after that. They left as well. And they had given me a hospital gown, which I didn't put on because I knew it would be really hard to leave a hospital unnoticed in a hospital gown. And so at this point, I realized, like, I am running away. That's my only option here. The police aren't going to help me. I decided, like, this is pretty much just a thing at this point of I have a very limited amount of time right now, and I need to get out. So I said that I had to go to the bathroom, and I went to the bathroom at the hospital, but it was really just because I was looking for a way to escape the hospital now, because I was looking for some kind of an exit. I realized that the group of rooms that I was assigned to, like one of the rooms, there was only one exit out of that little section of the hospital. And all of the nurses were sitting directly next to it in their offices. And I knew that all the nurses knew that I was not supposed to leave and that I was under a protective custody and that I was in police custody at this point. And so when I got up to go to the bathroom, when I was coming back and I was like looking around, obviously because that was the purpose of my trip, the nurse was a little bit suspicious and like, hey, why are you out of your room? And I was like, oh, I was just going to the bathroom. And while in the bathroom, I like sorted out and tidied my appearance because I wanted to look as normal as possible coming out of the hospital. And obviously, as I had been like throwing up and stuff previous to this, I looked a little bit rough. So I had tried my best to sort myself out, look as normal as I could. I was dressed for business casual at this point, so I felt like that would help me get out unnoticed because obviously, if I'm a young woman in slacks, a blouse, and a cardigan, that's not going to raise a ton of red flags. I don't look like any kind of crazy person. So I sorted out my appearance, I went back to my room, and upon arriving in my room, I pretty much like, I put all my belongings back in my purse because I had taken some stuff out. I pretty much set everything in order, and I closed the curtain to my room so that people wouldn't be able to look in and see that I was gone. And then I stood off in the corner and waited until none of the nurses were looking. And when none of the nurses were looking, because, you know, one of them that was kind of keeping an eye on me had like turned and was typing something into her computer, I just walked out like really quickly. Like, I wasn't running because I didn't want to raise any red flags. I just really quickly just walked out, tried to look as confident and normal as possible. And as soon as I was out that door, I turned down another hallway. I knew that there was an exit directly in front of me, but I didn't want to take that because I figured people might be waiting for me there if they were waiting for me. So I went down some random hallways, just kind of went to like the weirdest exit I could think to find. And when I reached that exit, I took off my cardigan because I'd already in the bathroom practiced like tying it over my head to look like some sort of headscarf because I wanted to obscure my face without looking too suspicious. So I left the hospital, and immediately upon leaving, I did that because I didn't know how hard they would look for me, but I wanted to cross like every T and dot every I and cover all my bases. Because, you know, it might sound a little bit silly. You're like, you know, okay, you've watched too many action movies, which maybe I have. But I wanted to make sure that there was zero chance of my parents finding me. I wanted to make sure that no matter who they questioned, no one I knew was involved, that they had no leads. So I left. I had already looked on Apple Maps and decided what route I was going to take. I then turned off all location services so that they couldn't even use my like Maps app to track me. So after looking at the map, I turned off location services and just used like a picture of it to guide my way. I ended up having to cut through, like, I think it was a campus or something, and then I was, like, walking through, like, dense foliage as well, which was not pleasant because I got bit up by a lot of little creatures, and I'm just glad a snake didn't get me. But I eventually reached where I was going, which was, like, a dark street corner with no cameras or anything like that, somewhere where basically I could disappear from and no one would have any leads, because obviously hospitals have security cameras, so they would obviously have footage of me leaving. And so I wanted to go somewhere that wouldn't have security cameras. Like, because a gas station or something like that, there would be a trail. Someone would have to show up there in a car. They could pull license plates or something like that. And so I went to a street corner with no street cameras, super dark. It's the middle of the night, right? I had someone pick me up from there. And I immediately changed into like loose fitting men's clothes so that I could, you know, hide out. And my previous outfit was pretty identifiable. I pinned all of my hair up in a beanie so that, you know, at a distance I just looked like a boy. At this point I had removed all my makeup and I was wearing like a beanie, and I had done other things to my appearance to pretty much change my appearance. And I left town. I was laying in the back seat until we got out of town, and then we successfully got out of town. And that was the beginning of my journey leaving, which was quite a journey.
Yeah, that is actually very impressive. I mean, even your brother John expressed like how impressed he was that you thought of that to call the ambulance. But it's even more involved, right? And you hit it right on the nose. I was going to ask you, where did you learn how to do all that? I mean, did you get some of that from movies? And I mean, because that's very impressive.
So what it is that after my initial like panic attack / mental breakdown upon seeing my dad, I had this initial like freak out, and then my brain had started working like very clearly because I'm usually actually a very logical person who thinks very like, okay, we're gonna do A and then B is gonna happen. And so I had come up with this entire like complicated plan of how I was gonna get away. And I had thought about like everything. Like I was like, okay, I'm gonna turn off cellular, I'm gonna turn off all location services, I'm going to not talk to these people. And I had told my aunt and uncle, like, hey, I just want you to know whatever's about to happen, that I'm going to be safe and everything's going to be okay. Because I knew what I was about to do. And I knew that it would probably worry them because obviously they cared about me and cared about my safety. But I did not tell them what exactly I was going to do, and they had no clue where I was going. They still to this day have no clue where I am. I've been very careful to not tell anyone. And I did not really leave any clues. And I'm not with anyone that people would guess at all because I made sure to not involve anyone from my previous life that anyone knew about. So I got a ride out of town in the middle of the night, and I had a lot of people help me along the way to get to where I was going because I didn't want any one person along the way to know where I was going. And also there was the fact that, if someone drives me like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, it's helpful and it gets me to where I'm going, but it's not too much of an inconvenience for them personally because they only have to drive me a couple hours and they're not crossing any state lines, so it's not as big of a legal issue for them as well. So I was very careful to, just involve people here and there, but there were obviously gaps in this journey where I was alone and just having to walk on my own. I didn't really have any money with me because I didn't want to use my card for fear of leaving a paper trail. I had a little bit of cash in my wallet, but probably under $20. I think I might have had like $10 or something, but not a lot. So I hadn't slept in quite a bit, and that night specifically, I remember I spent in a ditch behind a business. I believe it was some kind of like a hotel or something like that, but I slept in a ditch. Like I literally, and I didn't even sleep very much at all because I was afraid of like missing my ride the next morning. So I slept in a ditch, and I barely slept, to be honest. Like most of the night was spent laying awake, like on my back in a ditch. I was super dirty. I was miserable. I was cold. It was actually fairly cold outside, and I didn't have warm clothes. I didn't have any food. I didn't have any like water or anything. So I was thirsty. I was hungry. I was super tired. I was super cold. I was trying my best to stay awake. I think I drifted off a couple times in that night, but I turned off my phone completely because it was almost dead on power and I was afraid of being tracked. So I had nothing to do or keep me busy. The next morning, I restarted my journey and I drove more, and then there's obviously a lot more stuff like that on the way because it took me a bit to get to where I was going. It took me a while, but when I eventually got there, by the time I got to where I was going, I was filthy. I was super dirty. I was feeling gross. I had not showered or slept like a full night since all of this had started. I hadn't eaten like an actual meal. I bought like a pack of Pringles or something at the gas station at one point, but that was it. Like I had not had enough water or food. I had not been able to even like take a shower. So I was not doing well. My clothes were filthy. I had nothing but a purse full of like random odds and ends. And so when I finally got there, it was like the best feeling just to like take a shower and like eat and like sleep finally. And so once all of that happened, I was like, okay, well, now I'm starting my life over with nothing but the clothes on my back this time. Because the first time I had a suitcase of stuff and family, this time I didn't have any family helping me. I didn't have any like friends where I was going. I didn't really know anyone super well. And it was like I was going into the unknown with nothing but my clothes, essentially. That was it. That was what I had. And I was in communication with my brother Isaac, so he was doing his best to help me. But there wasn't really much he could do because we were not in the same state, and he was doing what he could, but it's like, there wasn't a lot he could do for me. So he was very helpful, and I appreciate his help throughout this. He's always been, very kind to me, and a really great brother to me. But it was difficult for me because now I'm starting over, right? So while all of this is going on, which is obviously like a crazy situation. I mean, like escaping police custody in the middle of the night and going on the run by yourself at 17, pretty crazy. Sleeping in a ditch, pretty crazy. But my dad was meanwhile lying to people and saying that I was still at my uncle's house. And so part of the reason, so the way that the interview with Jordan came about was that my brother John contacted me and said, "Hey, like, that dad's like lying about you, about all this stuff. Like, would you like to do an interview and set the record straight? Like, do you want to talk about this stuff publicly? Is that something that you're comfortable with?" And he said, "And I know that you really care about the younger kids too. I know that this isn't just me, and I know that you want them to be safe as well." And so he said, "Do you want to do an interview?" And he said, "If you don't want to, that's totally fine. I don't expect you to do an interview or anything like that." But he was like, "I'm going to send you Jordan's contact information." And he's like, "I'll leave it totally up to you." And so I don't think he ever actually ended up sending me Jordan's contact information because I think he like forgot to do it. But then a couple days later, actually, my brother Isaac reached out to me and was like, Dad's lying about you, right?" I was like, "Yes, I know Dad's lying and saying that I'm still with my uncle and denying the fact that he literally sent me on the run in the middle of the night by threatening me." and that he sent the police after me. And so I was like, yes, I know Dad's lying about me. And he was like, do you want to do an interview with Jordan? And I was like, well, yeah, sure, like I guess. And I originally had not wanted to do that, but like after seeing the way that my dad was and how he was willing to go to such extreme lengths to get me back for 4 months just so that he could like punish me for this original like offense or whatever by starting some nothing of an investigation unintentionally. After seeing that, I was very like, okay, my dad is being very dishonest with the public, because obviously my dad is a public figure in a way, because he's very well known amongst certain circles. And so I realized like he is lying to a lot of people about this. Like he's lying to his entire congregation, saying that I'm with my uncle, saying that he has any control over the situation. And people don't realize that his daughter is literally 17 and went on the run from him after being hospitalized for a panic attack.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense now, like why you did the interview, right? You're trying to set the record straight.
So he was lying to people. Like a lot of people actually had asked him, and I believe Pastor Shelley even had a conversation with my dad about this, where my dad, in that conversation with Pastor Shelley, which I'm not sure if he talked to my brother Isaac or John about this, I don't remember which one it was, but I know one of my brothers had talked to Pastor Shelley and been like, well, how do you justify the fact that Miriam is on the run right now? Like, literally, she's just off the grid. No one knows where she went. Like, there's no trail, you know? And he was like, no, that's not true. Like, she's staying with her uncle. That's what your dad told me. And my brother was like, that's not true. Like, my dad lied to you. And he was lying to a lot of people. And his congregation was not only completely unaware of all the abuse that had happened, but also unaware of the fact that at 17, I was a missing person / runaway, however they want to categorize that. And basically, no one was aware of this. And I thought about it, and I thought to myself, well, people are blindly following my dad. They're just writing off what my brothers have said based on, you know, their lifestyle or the way that they look or something like that. And I thought to myself, like, he is lying to people for a living, like, essentially, because he's a pastor. That's how he makes his money. And so for him to be misleading his congregation about the way that he lives his life, about the way that he treats his wife and raises his kids, is very dishonest. And for him to be completely, you know, I believe, disqualified from being a pastor, and instead of, and honestly, I think it should be up to his congregation to maybe think about that. Maybe he should seek the wisdom of other pastors. But that can't really be done without a level of honesty there about what's actually going on.
And I appreciate you recounting that story, because there's a lot of people in that church they're not going to watch you tell that story in your initial interview. That story has had like 70 some odd thousand views, but I don't think it's them. I think it's a different crowd, right? So I'm thankful that you recounted that, and then that's the reason you went on, right? You wanted to set the record straight. You wanted to make sure people knew that you weren't with your uncle, that kind of thing. And so
there was a level of my dad in private was being a totally different person than in public. My entire life, he had been this very abusive person in private. My mom had also been the same way, obviously. And I'll get into that a little bit, but because they were living this vastly different lifestyle in private, and then not only that, but they were also just in denial about this whole situation with me and lying to people, just flat out lying about where I was, what was going on. I felt the need to set the record straight, and I felt the need to seek out at least some understanding from people and some judgment on them, and maybe get the public eye to examine them a little bit closer and see, hey, all is not well here. This is not an okay situation. There are people being hurt right now, and there's a big thing going on here. Like, it's not some little thing for me to run away in the middle of the night and being laying in a ditch. That's not a little situation. That's a big situation. That's a situation that's a big deal. And for people to be unaware of this and thinking that all is well in our family and that we're this big happy family, that's inaccurate. And I wanted people to realize that people were being hurt, not just me, my siblings as well. And so I wanted to get help for them. And I also wanted this to be a wake-up call for my parents, because my parents have been in denial about all of this and lying about it, not acknowledging it, saying, oh, it didn't happen, or it's exaggerated, or, they're misconstruing this. And I wanted it to be a wake-up call for them. Like, you will be held accountable for your actions. People will know. We're not going to keep lying for you. We're not going to keep pretending like everything's fine. We're going to tell people the truth. And you're going to have to explain yourself, or you're going to have to apologize and do better. And with my first interview, as I said at the end, I really want my siblings to have a better childhood than me. And I want them to have a better life than me. I want my parents to correct this. I want my parents to seek out help, both for my parents' sake and my siblings' sake, because my parents have a lot left on their life, hopefully. They're only middle-aged, and they have so much time to seek help, not only from, the church and the Lord, but also, probably seek out some therapy and really just try to mend this and try to fix this. And I don't know, I don't know if my siblings should be taken away and placed with other family members. I think that would be beneficial. I think it would be a good idea, and it would give my parents to deal with whatever they're dealing with, in an environment where they're not hurting people. And it would give my siblings an opportunity to actually have a childhood and not be abused.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because earlier on you said stuff that's still going on, and John had mentioned that he thinks it's not to the level as it was with maybe you first four. Isaac expressed, like, if he ever found out, he'd do something about it now. Do you think there's still abuse going on at the home? Do you think that your siblings are safe there right now? Or do you think it's like what you said earlier also, it's, they keep you in the house after an assault and they keep you away from people so people don't see. Do you think that kind of thing is going on with your 8 siblings that are left at home?
Yeah, so I will say that the style of abuse has changed since I was a child. When I was a child, obviously, there were things going on, like my dad beating us with an electrical cord, beating my mom with an electrical cord. There were other punishments being used, like, for example, cold showers, which I talked about in the last video. They would threaten all sorts of things. They would say that we had to eat our own, like, when we got sick, we would have to, Anyway, I don't really want to get into that stuff because a lot of that stuff is very grisly and gnarly, but that is discussed in my other interview. They severely abused us in a lot of ways, which I explained in that last interview, but that has not stopped in that my parents are still very abusive to my younger siblings. For example, my brother, and I won't say his name to protect him from whatever fallout this could bring on him, but one of my little brothers actually confided in me, and I know someone else who he confided in, that his head will constantly be hurting and that he gets a lot of headaches, and that he thinks it's from my mom hitting him in the head, which I have seen my mom hit this particular sibling in the head many, many times. Like even hitting a child once in the head, right? Just like going like this or going like that, or something that she does frequently. She she'll go like this to a kid's head. But like even going like this to a kid's head, like on top of a kid's head like this, or going like this, or like basically she'll backhand them, or she's punched me in the face before. She hasn't punched any of my little siblings like in the face to my knowledge, thankfully. Because that would obviously be horrifying. But she has backhanded all of my siblings in the face, which is obviously a painful thing to do. It's much more painful than a slap. And she will do this thing where she will go like this to the top of their head and basically beat the top of their head with a closed fist. And he basically confided in me that his head would constantly hurt from that. And he actually told someone else as well, who was immediately super concerned by that, obviously, and like, what in the world? Why is she doing this? You're a little kid. And so things like that are still going on, where she will just, and this is not like oh, you're in trouble, thing. She will randomly just lash out and engage in these kinds of behaviors where she will just be hitting a kid's head and face, just because she's angry. Or a kid will, while they're doing schoolwork, like turn away for a second, and she literally just wham across the face. Or she will do this thing where she just like grabs their head and just starts like shaking them or something like that. She also does this thing to little kids where she will drag them by their ear to the point where they will like fall down, and she will be dragging them just by their ear, just hauling them along, which is very painful. She also slaps like with her hand like very hard on the ear, which can actually it can burst your eardrum, and it's very painful. And when I'm talking about these things here, let me be clear, this is small children. So while these things might not sound severe to an adult, to a 5-year-old, to a 6-year-old, to a 7-year-old, these things are very damaging. And my siblings have exhibited um a lot of traits that show that these things are harming them. Like, for example, my siblings will not be potty trained on time, and then they will have a lot of issues with that. Like, my siblings will, throughout the course of my family, my siblings have always struggled with like bedwetting, bad behavior. They lash out constantly. All of my little siblings like curse like sailors, and they will lash out. They will be very angry, very upset. Some of them will not talk to people. Like, I'm thinking of one of my little brothers. He's very removed. He's pretty much, as someone once told me, every time I see, not gonna say his name, he's sitting in a corner by himself crying. And that was probably the most accurate description of him I've ever heard. Like, he just doesn't talk to anyone. He's just this little removed guy, and you can see that he's not really doing well. And also, my parents still do lash out and beat people. As to my knowledge, they have not used the cord in a few years, but they still lash out and beat people. I remember just recently, my dad actually freaked out on the road trip that I went with him on. My brothers were being too loud while he was in some kind of a college class. He was doing some sort of like a test or something, and he decided that they were too loud, and he beat them severely, and they had extreme welts and bruising on their back and arms. And I remember it was during the summertime that we took that trip, and he, for the rest of the trip, did not allow them to go swimming because they were beaten and bruised and marked so badly from that he did not want them to be shirtless or even to have a shirt that would, be showing that. So they were not allowed to go swimming after that because he was very worried about them being shirtless and those marks showing.
So they very actively make sure that they hide it, right? Because there's a lot of people that say, "Oh, we've never seen this at all."
Yes, and I will say about that, because people have mentioned that, I was always, I want people to think about this for a second. I was always dressed really poorly for the season. Like, it would be the middle of summer in Phoenix, and I would be wearing like a jacket or a long sleeve shirt. And I understand that, obviously in the IFB and stuff, there's an idea of modesty, and that was already a way that my parents hid a lot of marks, obviously, because if this entire section of our body is covered up, there's a lot of, like, no one's ever going to see my back with bruising and stuff, because it's just like, oh, modest clothing. And so a lot of marks were hid that way, but also I was always dressed very out of season, and I know a lot of my siblings were constantly dressed that way as well, to hide marks. Because if they would beat our backs, often the marks would end up on our arms as well, because obviously if you're hitting someone very hard and kind of indiscriminately, they're going to get marks on their necks, often collarbones, like this area of our chest, our arms frequently. And so we would constantly be dressed like out of the season. Like, it would be summertime, and we're wearing long sleeves or some kind of a jacket or something like that, and that was often to hide marks. And not only that, but my parents were also pretty clever about getting around marks, because what they would do is they would beat our thighs and our backs a lot, or even like our chests and stuff, because those were things that were hidden. Those were things that people couldn't see. My mom would often leave marks places where people can find, like, she would beat the bottoms of little kids' feet. She continues to do this, by the way. But she would hold little kids upside down and beat the bottoms of their feet, because that's, again, something that people don't see. If a little kid has marks on their feet, that's not going to be seen.
I think that it's very important that people that are listening understand and really grasp what you're saying, because you're giving all of the aspects of someone that's been abused. You're one of the brothers often alone, the way that they don't interact. The bedwetting is huge.
Oh, yeah. One of my siblings wet the bed until they were 11, another one until they were 9. My sister, who I will not name, is still, to my knowledge, not potty trained at the age of 4. And she actually has severe health problems now because my parents, instead of potty training her when she reached the age of 3, they were embarrassed that she wasn't potty trained. And so they started beating her every time she didn't go in the toilet, even though she wasn't potty trained. I mean, she didn't really know any better. She was a 3-year-old who my parents were kind of just essentially too lazy to potty train. And so they started just beating her and shaming her every time she went like in her diaper instead of the toilet, to the point where she became so scared of going in her diaper that she started holding the bathroom for days on end and became extremely constipated and would intentionally like not drink water and stuff and refuse to take any like laxatives or anything because she was so scared of going in her diaper instead of the toilet. And she was actually taken to the doctor multiple times for this. I believe she was taken to the hospital, the emergency room as well, because it was so severe. It was getting to a dangerous level because you can potentially die of that, essentially. And it would get to the point where she was sick. She was like physically ill, like laying on the sofa, like looking absolutely like she's like sweaty, she's clammy, she had severe health problems. And it got to the point where my parents literally kept her on laxatives nonstop. Like, she would be given laxatives morning and night, and they kept her on laxatives nonstop. Like, the last time I was living at home, which obviously it's been a few months, so maybe this has changed since then. When I was living at home, she was on laxatives morning and night every day, and she was still not potty trained. She would occasionally, be able to go in the toilet, but she was in diapers for the most part. And when she was in diapers, if she used the bathroom or a diaper, frequently my parents would yell at her, shame her, beat her. I remember that there was an incident when my mom and I were out of town where my dad was getting super upset with her. Um, and he was refusing to actually take her to the doctor to get her medical help. He was trying to fix it on his own. I don't want to go into the details of that because obviously this is a very horrible and a very personal topic, but that's just one example of the stuff that's currently going on, and that's obviously super harmful. When someone's 3 and 4 years old and they're being told, hey, you're stupid, all of your friends are potty trained and you're not, and you're behind, and you're so, how dare you not go in the toilet. Like, obviously I understand that it's frustrating to not have kids that are potty trained. I understand that, and that can be frustrating. But the way that they responded took an issue that was minor and made it something that was major, where my sister's being hospitalized and being taken to the doctor and being on medication that I really don't think is healthy to just be on permanently.
So your dad yesterday came out with a sermon. This would have been Sunday, and he said he's trying to prove that he's still qualified. And so first and foremost, he dismisses 1 Timothy 3. He says, well, that's just for someone that's new and you're trying to prove them, but I've already been proved because I've been a pastor this whole time. And then he goes on to say, but the things that they're talking about, his 4 oldest children, are things that happened a long time ago. They aren't happening anymore. So if I was unqualified, then I must have been unqualified in 2010, kind of thing. What do you say to that, especially now given what you just said?
So first of all, while, as I said, their style of abuse has changed. They still do beat kids frequently, just way above and beyond what would at all be considered spanking. They don't use the electrical cord anymore, to my knowledge. I don't know if my dad still beats my mom with an electrical cord. I know that he did that when I was a child. I've seen it happen, actually. I remember watching that happen. I would also hear it frequently because we would sometimes be sent outside. I could hear my mom screaming inside, begging him to stop, calling for us to help. It's not like we could do anything. And I don't know if that aspect is still going on. I don't know if he still beats her with an electrical cord. I have in recent time seen my dad blow up at my mom, curse her out, throw stuff at her, throw stuff on the floor. He likes to pull stuff out of cabinets and just start hurling it all over the place. Like, he will hurl plates, glasses. I've seen him just rip stuff out of her hand, throw it, throw stuff at her. He still will hit her occasionally. But I have not seen him beat her with an electrical cord or heard that in the last few years. And I think that's mainly because my brothers are grown up and have threatened him if he were to do something like that. And so I think he knows better than that at this point. But things were still bad enough a few years ago or maybe this was like, I'm trying to remember exactly when this was. I have a bad sense of time, but this was recently that my mom thought things were bad enough to where she wanted to leave him. And she actually, the beating was still happening enough. Apparently, I guess he was still beating her because we have Ring cameras in our house that are used to mainly watch us kids. Like, my mom basically connected all these Ring cameras. They were all over the house in all sorts of rooms to basically watch us. We had them in our bedrooms. We had them at different points in different hallways. They would kind of be moved around sometimes, but they would be put in kids' bedrooms. They would be put in living areas and the school areas, and they were basically to watch us. My mom had all these cameras. She would watch kids with them. She would get kids in trouble for stuff. When she left the house, she would constantly be monitoring these cameras to make sure that kids weren't like taking food or something while she was gone, because we had cabinet locks in our old house, but we didn't in our new house, and taking food without permission was like a big no-no. And so what ended up happening was that she actually wanted to collect evidence on my dad to take him to court and get him in trouble for beating her and beating the kids. And so she took like little pieces of black tape, and Ring cameras have a blue light that lights up when they are on and when they're recording. And she took black tape and covered that up very carefully to where you didn't notice the tape. And the reason for this was that she said that she wanted to catch my dad beating her on camera. She said that she wanted to get a video of him beating her and assaulting her to take to police, essentially, because she knew that without that video, it's going to be really hard to prove anything, because even if you have bruises, there's no way to say where those came from. Like, that's the thing with abuse, it's super hard to prove. Like, if you have a bruise, there's no way of telling, okay, well, this came from this, you know? And she had asked us if we would testify against my dad, and I think the general consensus was either people didn't want to testify, or they said that they would only testify if they testified against her as well. And so I guess she decided her only option was to actually get a video of my dad assaulting her. And she covered up these blue lights with tape. And the way that my mom is she'll like swing back and forth on an idea like really quickly. And so a few days later, she was over it and like didn't want to do this anymore. But
Well, do you think it has to do with a lot of footage being captured of herself doing things?
So we actually did address that with my mom at one point, because we said, you know, we've heard rumors that Ring leaks footage to the police. And we said, so what happens if there's footage of you, you know, beating a kid on there? And she was like, that's not true, and that's illegal for Ring to do, so they couldn't use it against me in a court of law. But she ended up later claiming to us, because obviously if my dad got wind of her trying to go to the police and leave him, he would obviously freak out and probably beat her up even worse. But because of that, she kind of claimed like, oh, no, the tape is just there to, because I think he might have found out about the tape. She was like, oh, no, the tape is just there so that, you know, I can spy on the kids without them knowing. That's a blatant lie. And my mom knows it. Like, if my mom's watching this, she knows that the reason why she put the tape on things with cameras, as she personally told me, and I believe she told my siblings the same thing, was that she wanted to get my dad on camera beating her up. And she even told us, because we would always like complain about the cameras and talk about them, being like, this is creepy, like, why are you watching us all the time? Why do you have a camera in my bedroom, you know? And we would complain about them, and she said, anyone who complains about those cameras one more time is going to get a serious spanking, because she said, I don't want dad to remember that I have cameras, because she said, I don't want him to be thinking about it or remembering it. She said, I want him to forget that we have cameras, because she said, otherwise he's going to think about that and not want to beat me up if he knows that there's a camera in the room, and he's going to take me to a different room. So she said, I want him to forget which rooms I have cameras in. I don't want him to be thinking about the cameras. So she forbade us from ever talking about the cameras for that reason. She said, do not bring up the cameras. I don't want him thinking about that. I don't want him remembering that I had those. I don't want him knowing which rooms that they're in. And she said, I want to get him on camera beating me up. So she never talked about the tape over the cameras in front of him. That was a big no-no. Like, we were not allowed to talk about the tape on the camera.
How long ago was that? Like that?
This was probably around a year ago.
Okay.
I would guess. Probably around a year ago.
Do you think they're going to wind up getting divorced? Do you think that she'll ever get to that point?
I don't know, because my mom has talked about getting divorced from my dad. My mom, when I was a child, and I mentioned this in my last interview, but my mom, up until pretty much now. I do realize that I have not been living in my household, or my parents' household rather, for months now, so I can't really speak super currently. I can only speak about what was going on about, I guess, 4 or 5 months ago, because I left on, let's see, I left on like June 13th, so all of this is current up till June 13th. That's what I'm talking about. So when I say right now, that's what I mean, because things might have changed since then, but I really doubt it. So up until then, though, she would constantly say, I'm leaving, I'm never going to come back. And when I was a kid, she would say that all the time. She would then leave, and I don't know where she went, maybe the grocery store or something. And I would genuinely believe that my mom was not going to come back. And I would think to myself, like, oh no, like, maybe mom won't come back today. Like, maybe she won't be back. And that was like a very real fear of mine. And I also frequently thought that my mom might divorce my dad as a kid. Or at the very least, she would just say, I'm leaving. Like, I'm just leaving. Like, she wouldn't say, like, I'm gonna get a divorce. She would just be like, I'm driving away and never coming back. Or she would say, I'm going to Germany or something. And she would say that. And I think she said it to me a lot, too, because obviously I'm the oldest daughter, so I think there was an element of, like, she saw me as this other woman that, like, would take her side. Which my mom and I were never close growing up, as in, we were never, like, I don't know, whatever mothers and daughters do together kind of bonding thing. That's not really how we were. But my mom, when she was in trouble, she would sometimes come to me because I was always very sympathetic towards her. And to this day, I feel very bad for my mom because as awful as the things that she has done are, as awful as those things are, my mom has been abused. From the time that she was a child up until now, she was very abused by her parents as a child, unfortunately, and that breaks my heart to even think about. But into her adult life, she only had a few years of respite between being abused by her parents and being abused by her husband. She got married young, she got married at 21, and she went from being abused by one set of people to a new person who kind of took over her life and abused her. And it makes me feel sad to think about the fact that my mom has never really gotten to experience what healthy relationships in your family look like. She's never gotten to just experience what it's like to not be afraid and not be worried about abuse and stuff like that. And so I feel bad for my mom, and if my mom sees this video, I hope that you know that I'm not, like, mad at you, or I don't hate you or anything like that. And really what I want from my mom more than anything is I really want her to get help. Like, because I want my mom to I want her to get better, and I want her to be able to, I mean, her youngest kid is now 2 years old, right? And if she picks up the pieces, right? If she goes to therapy, if she gets help, if she makes any effort to fix this, right? If she treats him well and gives him a good childhood, he will not remember any of this. He will not know about any of this. He can grow up and think, wow, my mom's so great. My mom loves me and she's awesome. And, like, that would be great. Not only for him, but also for my mom. And my mom could actually, she could fix this in a way. And, like, obviously she can never fix what she did to me. She can never fix what she did to my brothers. But I don't want that. Like, the damage is already done with me. Like, they already did that damage. They already made those mistakes. But I have little siblings, and they don't have to repeat those mistakes. They have the option to not repeat those mistakes. And so from my point of view, like, I feel bad because I feel like my mom has, like, given into the classic hurt people. And she could do so much better than that. Like, she could actually turn this around, I believe. Like, and I don't think my mom's any kind of saint or anything, and I think she has some major emotional damage and is a very hurting person who has hurt a lot of people. And I don't want to in any way sound like I'm defending her actions, because I'm not defending her actions. And at the end of the day, obviously she is responsible for what she does. And she's responsible for everything that she did to me and everything that she did to my siblings. But at the same time, I just don't want to see her continue this throughout the lives of all of my siblings. I'd rather see her seek out some help and get better. And if to get better and seek out help, she has to leave my dad to do that, then you know what? Then maybe she needs to take a break from being around him. Maybe that should happen. I'm not really gonna speak to what should happen because I don't know. This is obviously a very difficult and complicated situation, and I'm not really sure how to go forward from here. But I figured that the best place to start is a place of truth and just talking about what's going on. And then, you know, maybe other people can enter into the conversation and maybe they could get counseling and, you know, maybe other people could speak into their lives and help them. I'm only 17 years old. I don't know everything. I don't necessarily know how to rectify such an extreme situation. But I do know that whatever happens from here on out needs to start from a place of honesty and truth. It needs to start from a place of, there are these kids in a situation where they're being hurt. They're being beaten. They're being constantly just cut down by their parents. They're seeing their dad scream and curse at their mom. Their mom is screaming and cursing at them. They're in an environment where even my younger siblings have seen my dad assault my mom. Like, I would say probably anyone from the age of, like, maybe, I don't really know when he stopped, like, assaulting her in front of us. But there are still kids in that household that have definitely seen that stuff. And I don't know if he still is. My mom, at least, you know, a year ago or whatever, was still saying that he was still assaulting her. I don't know how severe that is. I know that they have had some severe fights since we've moved into our new house, which was about 4 years ago, where he would, I think, assault her. And they do sometimes just leave during a fight. I don't really know what happens when they do that. But, obviously, even if my dad is no longer beating my mom with the electrical cord, him hitting her in the face or throwing stuff at her is still not good. It's still toxic. Him cursing her out, and threatening her, and I have seen him threaten to beat her, since being in the new house, this is all very recent, obviously, the last 4 years. So I'm not sure if he ever followed through on those threats while being in the new house, but he did threaten those things.
Thank you for watching this episode of Rediscover People podcast. During our conversation with Miriam, we realized that this is probably going to take a 2-part episode, and so we want to cut now, and there's so much more to come. We still talk to Miriam for well over an hour and a half more than this, and we want you to hear everything that she has to say. Some of the things that are coming might be something that you've never heard before. In fact, I probably know it is. And so we've divided this into 2 parts. This is part 1, and the next one will be premiering soon. And so we'll see you next time on the Rediscover People podcast.